Hello, very beautiful community. Let me know if you can see and hear me. What happened was that my wheelchair took on a life of its own and it crashed into my bedside table. Lots of things fell, including the mouse to this computer, which, because I can't stand, and at the moment tonight I'm at home alone, I couldn't reach. And so, beautiful community, we had a logistical problem. However, beautiful community, with the help of several grabbers I have, which extend the distance, I managed to retrieve the mouse. I apologize for this inconvenience. We're talking about politics and cultural difference, politics and cultural relativism. So, before we do our little cultural ritual of jumping through the questions left at the beginning, Ricky is under the bed, hiding after he got let out last time on the chat channel. Didn't go well, so he's hiding. So, just to say that we will read the questions left at the beginning briefly. We do this scrolling up ritual all the time. But let me say a few things first about cultural difference and politics. How to think about this conceptually. If this is very tiring, just grab a pillow. We're going to be about 5 minutes. Let's say something about physics, something about evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology, and then something about social sciences. Now, there are a very small number of human beings who are particularly eccentric, who think that physics explains everything. Now, there is a certain sense in which that thought heads in the right direction, namely that nothing happens in the world without the redistribution of microphysical states. But if you ask the question, what can physics explain? And the answer came back, everything, taken literally, that would be a very eccentric answer indeed. Can physics explain Beethoven's late quartets? Can it explain the outbreak of the Second World War? Can it explain why there's 125 people in this space and not 225 or 725? So I want to just put aside as eccentric the notion of physicalist reductionism, which says that we don't need anything except physics to explain how human societies work, that all other levels of explanation are sort of trivial or ephemeral and properly should get reduced to physicalist explanation. That's a ridiculous thought to have about talking about politics and culture. Now, the second thought that is much more prominent, and in fact is in some ways the default way of thinking in our culture, is that evolution explains life under culture. Evolution explains why the Second World War broke out. Evolution explains why Putin invaded Ukraine. And of course, evolution explains our propensity to develop cultures and live under culture. But it doesn't explain what happens inside cultures. It radically underdetermines that. And that evolution radically underdetermines what happens under culture is itself determined by evolution. It's the most remarkable evolutionary achievement of our species that evolution underdetermines what occurs under culture. Evolution might determine the particular way in which we develop a capacity to make music, but it has nothing at all to say about the development of a particular blues tradition in the 1920s. Therefore, the very notion that you can get away without internal cultural explanation and just have evolution explain it for you is ridiculous, and in fact is a contradiction of what evolutionary theory states. Now, the third remark is about the social sciences. What I say here is that the social sciences can't be modeled on the natural sciences in the way they give us explanation of the world. The social sciences require particular kinds of insight, particular kinds of intuition that are not shared and are not even transparently articulable. And therefore, it doesn't follow that disagreement in the social sciences is relative or subjective. What follows is that disagreement is interpretive or hermeneutical. It is a matter of inferior and superior insight that cannot be modeled on any kind of science of verification. So, putting these three foundations down, we can almost get off the pillow because we're going to put down one last foundation. And that's the broken record I always go on about, namely that when we explain what happens in different countries in the world today, we have to understand that some of our explanation will rightly be in the mode of cultural explanation, but other kinds of explanation we might use will be in the mode of social explanation. And that means that there's a difference between these two, but it's not sharp. What is it? Very roughly, social explanation tells us how different cultures respond in the same way when exposed to certain social forces. Cultural explanation says something about what's distinctive about the various kinds of images floating around in a particular culture, and how that affects whatever it is we're trying to explain. So, for instance, in the video about Trump and Putin and their monarchist, somewhat fascistized, hyper neoliberal authoritarianism, I said that 20% perhaps or 30% of what is happening with Putinism in Russia has a cultural explanations to do with things that are distinctively culturally Russian, various kinds of cultural deformations that are distinctively Russian. The rest of it is just an exaggerated product of global social forces. The depoliticization, the trend toward authoritarianism, and so on, is not so much a product of Russian culture. It's just a product of Russia being a sort of extreme test site for generic global force. That's actually one way in which Russian culture very often interacts with social force type explanation, namely that what Russian culture typically does is it takes generic global forces and transplants them onto the Russian space in an exaggerate, often in a comically exaggerated form. One last remark. It's important to avoid fascism with cultural explanation by being intellectually lazy in distinguishing the cultural from the genetic. So, for instance, I tweeted the other day that something was mischaracterized in the way Putin said something. Putin's full of genocidal rhetoric about Ukraine, but there was a particular occasion where he didn't quite do the genocidal rhetoric that he was described as doing, and I pointed that out. And somebody from Moldova came along and said, "Well, Vlad, are you defending Russia? I wonder if that comes from your heritage, your roots." And that's fascist. Partly comical and partly fascist. So what's fascist about it? It's the conflation of and the sort of the lazy intermediary, the lazy intermediation in thought about what's genetic and what's cultural. Um, so you see what I mean? If we try to say that the Russians are some kind of Asiatic horde, we'd need to say at what level that claim is being made. At the genetic level, it's ludicrous because all such claims are ludicrous and racist. At a cultural level, it doesn't quite work. So what's left is a social force type explanation. Well, it wouldn't work either because you're trying to say something particular about a particular culture. So you've got to be careful about that. We do a lot of it actually, especially when we do sort of virtuous misinformation. I just say lazy things about other cultures. Often we do that about China much more than about Russia, actually. Um, and so the answer to that silly comment of the dude from Moldova would be, dude, if you want to do genetics, I'm actually more Ukrainian than Polish than Russian. And if you want to do culture, I'm psychologically pretty much Western. And so if you're in Moldova, you're going to be much more psychologically closer to Russians than I am. And so where are you going to go with your argument? And so what I want to warn against is this kind of lazy um, oscillation between some kind of genetic claim and a cultural claim, whereby when somebody presses you on the culture, you kind of turn back on the genetics, and somebody presses you on the genetics because it's ludicrous to claim that that thing genetically, turn back on the culture. So you've got to be careful about that. And There's a real tendency that we do that lazily. Now, you can sometimes make an argument about the propensity of authoritarianism of a certain culture, but you've got to make it intentional. You can't make it using this device. Um, you know, uh, Otherwise, you'll end up saying daft things like that. Chinese people don't care about freedom, um, which aren't going to stand up to much scrutiny. Okay, I've raved and ranted. Let's do a hyper quick run through questions. Echelon, good to see you up for another live. I was a bit worried about the last one. Yeah, I had to end the last live in a kind of emergency way, because often when the violent volatility of my health sort of goes on its own trajectory, it can often feel like like an elevator that's dropping. How radical the change from minute to minute can be in states. And so I began to plummet, but I very calmly and articulately ended the chat just in time. And I'm doing this one without oxygen, having pre-mealed on oxygen, but hopefully we'll be able to get through without. Okay, let's race through the questions. Jan, the current anti-democratic wave is obviously a global movement. To what extent is it fair to criticize domestic politicians for support for this movement outside of our borders? Um, what kinds of reasons can you think of against the idea that that's fair? If I criticize Nigel Farage for being post-truth in his communication, and then I criticize him for liking Trump, who is post-truth in his communication, what's the problem with that? What do you anticipate the obstacle there? Maybe I'm not thinking of something that you're thinking of. What's the problem with doing that? Yes, of course, extremely bad, irresponsible behavior is important to criticize, even when it's about expressing a liking for somebody, outside of your polity, somebody in your polity expressing a liking for somebody outside of your polity. Especially with America, because America is in a domino relation with Europe in terms of democratic sustenance. If American democracy collapses, European democracies will collapse faster. Chipulis, how should a regular person be competent in the internal politics and culture of other countries? What should be their posture of opinion holding and public expression? It's about your personality. But what I recommend for anybody is to explore for yourself what is a minimal threshold of comprehension, below which it feels like it doesn't make sense to have an opinion. So let's take an example. You're looking at the UK politician Jeremy Corbyn from America, but you don't know much about British politics. And so the natural default is to think he's like a UK Bernie Sanders. My advice would be, don't think that. Just think he could be like the UK Bernie Sanders, but he might not be. And to know that, I probably need to expose myself to, let's say, 2 to 4 hours of unedited speech by Jeremy Corbyn. I don't recommend you necessarily do that, but if you wanted to make that judgment, that's what you'd need to do. At the same time, other things are very clear. The number of innocent people that Israel obliterated in Gaza is excessive beyond any conceivable measure, right? It's a kind of gross, irresponsible murderousness. Of course, we're on the internet. We need to acknowledge the barbarism of October 7th too, and condemn it. But when you are responded to with remarks like you don't understand military like military targeting, so you can't form a view, dude, I'm an adult human, I can see this shit is not proportionate, shut up, stop it with your lecture about yeah this you don't know how the military works. No, sorry, just say no, flat no to that. So there are some things you can absolutely clearly judge, right? Other things you need to take time with. So what I do recommend, I recommend a very basic ethical confidence about things that are simple. Don't be scared about that. Don't let people bullshit you about that, you know? Um, but when it comes to more nuanced judgments, set up a little threshold for yourself and then work with it. Sorry, I've been so mean. And it's mean to pull grimaces like I have, but mm, I'm trying to motivate you to be able to hold yourself back on nuanced issues, but also to propel yourself clearly into the position you take ethically, and just tolerate no nonsense from people who are trying to gaslight you. Right? Well, you haven't been to Russia, so how do you know whether Putin is a good leader or not? Now, let's hurry up a bit because I'm being too slow. What is one's relationship to one's own country's political past and a past political culture? For example, as an American, well, not guilty for promoting slavery or genocide, am I collectively responsible? Yes, of course. Yes, of course. But you're not guilty. You're responsible, but you're not guilty. You're also not a trespasser. You're a legitimate citizen. You can't say that something happened a couple of 100 years ago, and thereby many generations down the line, Australians, Americans, Canadians, because of the shocking things that happened to the native populations, that were done to the native population, that you're illegitimate. From the fact that these are dark histories, it doesn't follow that a plumber in Adelaide in 2025 is some kind of intruder who is not a legitimate citizen. That is a kind of a too woke for your own good excess of decolonization. Do you have any tips to shield us or our friends from importing political disagreement from abroad? It's nearly impossible to do that, but I will be doing a workshop on how we negotiate with the aim of being more efficacious citizens, but also just having better mental health, the online political space. Watch out for that. Echelon, I like the concept of the EU being a post-imperial entity that values cultural differences while striving for shared values. I'm struggling about what it's become. Can it be reformed? Or perhaps I'll put the question like this: can a project like the EU exist in the world that's adopting a new mindset of might makes right? No, it can't. But it's even worse. The EU can't really exist effectively in a world in which people are experiencing a profound crisis of self-governance, right? A lot of the most irrational positions that people take today are a product of a thirst for self-government that they feel has been confiscated from them. Um, it feels like globalization has put people adrift. They don't just feel that they don't control their politics. They don't even feel their country controls its politics. It's just a precarity in the wind that is intolerable, and that's why there's this kind of hyper reaction that's absurd, right? When, for instance, people say that not to get into pandemic politics too much, but when people say that masks are not effective, um, putting aside whether we talk about people wearing or not wearing masks in particular context, that's irrelevant for us today. What's relevant is, are they actually effective? Like N95 masks. I would recommend the view that people who think that they're not effective are not wrong about masks. They're wrong at some previous level because it's so obvious that masks are effective. Maybe obvious is too strong a word, but it ought to be apparent that they're effective. And your problem isn't understanding or misunderstanding masks if you don't think that an N95 mask works. Doesn't mean you need to wear it, but it works for certain purposes. But why do people say no, they don't work? Even to the point that their arguments look so farcical that an 8-year-old shouldn't undersign them. It's because they're battling against, they're pushing away some kind of imposition on them that they're allergic to because they're experiencing an absolute crisis of self-governance. I don't control anything here. I control nothing, and you're making me do that thing. Oh, go screw you! Just right. That's there's a so one of the things that shows is that it's very important in destructive human behavior to recognize when it's destructive, but also to see what constructive elements destructive behavior contains. In Russia, one opinion is that failing to condemn Soviet ideology and desovietize was a grave mistake and a moral failure. Uh, Meanwhile, France never de-Jacobinized, and it didn't affect them. Why? Well, the Jacobin moment was a much more um, short and traumatic moment that was rejected by the polity, and the political institutions that survived it were gradually reset onto a republican and democratic direction. That's not the case with the Soviet Union, so there is a significant difference there. Follow-up question: is there a certain way that Russians should view the Soviet past to become more healthily democratically? Yes, they should historicize it, in the sense that they should think of it historically. At the moment, they think of it in a post-truth way, where anything is projected onto these past figures, or Stalin is just a cipher into which you put anything you like. Shipyanka. Hey, Vlad, I wanted to ask you about Russian culture in the 90s, about Yagoletov, about the 60 Seconds program. What are your thoughts? Well, Letov is a guy who founded a sort of post-punk rock group. 60 Seconds, the program is presented by Mr. Nevzorov, who is now a pro-Ukrainian activist. Um, mm, I think the key issue there is how much freedom, and freedom of what kind, was Russia capable of. And the answer is that politically, the prognosis was very, very negative. But culturally, Russia has an enormous tradition of rebellion against authoritarianism. Russia is one of the founding cultures of anarchism. Um, so there was a lot of um, fervor in connection with the value of liberty, um, in a sense, and in a sense there wasn't. So to be specific, there was a lot of fervor about the value of freedom, really, which is a kind of a pre-political version of liberty. It's about me being able to do what I want to do to express myself, roughly. Um, but that never got converted into a mature political understanding of liberty. So the 1990s were a period of a kind of a depoliticized thirst for freedom that never made political progress. To Jew, right? Does Trump admire Putin more than Xi, and does he admire them for different reasons? Yes, Trump is racist. He doesn't understand Chinese people. Doesn't like to think about them. They're just weird. You can make jokes about them, but don't need to reflect about them, in his view. And he admires Xi's power, but he doesn't connect with him emotionally at all. He doesn't connect with Putin, but he connects with an idea of Putin emotionally. He doesn't connect with an idea of Xi emotionally at all. And he is completely incurious about how Xi feels about things, how he functions. That's the difference. Hey, Vlad, what are your thoughts about DM25, the Yanis Varoufakis platform? Well, I mean, they're pretty much a broadcasting and media platform now. There's a lot that Yanis says that I don't like. There's a lot that Yanis says that I like. Um, I am somebody who is more likely to recommend policies that look, in particular instances, left, without myself coming from a left tradition. One of the biggest differences I would have with somebody like Naomi Klein, who I like, whose views I like more than Yanis's. But one of the differences I'm going to have with Naomi, who I really admire, is that she's going to explain more of what's going wrong in terms of capitalism, and I'm going to explain more of what's going wrong with the climate crisis, with our democracies, in terms of human nature and the interaction of humans and politics. Alex, can you speak about cultural analysis versus stereotype versus human universal conditions? Well, we have a universal human psychology. Psychologically, in that sense, you're the same as the ancient Greeks, you're the same as humans even before then. But that psychology radically underdetermines life under culture, radically underdetermines how it gets filled out under culture. And so, what we want to always understand is the interaction of the universal aspects of human nature and how they get expressed and elaborated under particular cultural circumstances. Now, what's the role of stereotypes here? Well, in a certain sense, I'm not going to be completely against stereotypes, because stereotypes can be a starting point, as long as you're able to reflect beyond them. So what you don't want to do with stereotypes is just get stuck in them. You want to, if you're going to have them at all, which you inevitably will because you're human, what you want is to begin reflecting on them and to begin cultivating your muscle for being able to shift the stereotypes you have, either because they contain prejudice at the level of beliefs or at the level of images without being prejudicial at the level of beliefs. So that's one thing you've got to do. Another thing you've got to do is understand that definite claims about particular cultures are not just prejudice. They can be false or they can be true. So don't be shy about making definite claims about other cultures. But just understand that these claims are difficult to make and that you're going to be in trouble when you make them, because most humans are not perceptive enough to make very many definite claims about other cultures. And because you're in the realm of intuition and insight, you're not going to be able to blast somebody into a particular understanding. But claims like culture X has an inadequate or a corrupt or a pathological relationship with food is a completely legitimate claim. Um, you have to understand that that's a tendentious claim about a culture. That means that some of the most remarkable people who are completely innocent of that pathology could also be found in that culture. So you have to understand what kind of thing we're saying. We're making tendentious claims. Um, when we say Germany is like X and France is like Y, what we're saying is that X is much more culturally supported as a place to land in Germany, and Y is much more supported as a place to land in France. It doesn't mean that that's where everyone's going to land. It means there is a certain kind of tendency. Hello from Czechia. Hello back. I love Czechia. Used to spend summers in the Czech countryside in a tiny village called Chvalkov, not far from Kamienica, um, which contains one of the oldest trees in Europe. Do you see any cultural legacy of Central and Eastern Europe that fulfilled the Western hope to bring a fresh air and new ideas after 1989? Such as Václav Havel's legacy. Any thoughts? Um, Fresh air, yes. New ideas, roughly, no. Um, what you have in these cultures is a visceral, recent memory of authoritarianism, which we in the West don't have. But you also have much more fragile democratic institutions in these countries historically over, let's say, a century. You also have a real crisis um, with understanding how to reconcile multiculturalism and democracy. And you have a real crisis with ex conservative authoritarians um, being set up to dominate politics for the years to come. Fresh air, yes. New ideas, I doubt it. Ross, as a Canadian, no qualms about judging US political culture. Less proximate cultures, I'd be more hesitant, but I suppose there's some bedrock of cross-cultural commonality, reasonable position. I don't think that's reasonable. I don't think that's the only thing you can say. The other thing you can say is that this is about confrontation. Whatever is the truth about cultural relativism, um, the truth about how you interact with other cultures can't be dependent on that because there is actual confrontation. Let me give you an example. When I was leaving Tonga, a, a kid, sort of, school, 17-year-old school kid from the village who helped around the house was very upset that I was leaving and wanted um, to take my stuff, but also cried about how upset she was that I was leaving. Um, in There are two things there about which I don't want to get into a conversation: how far that's an expression of the particular local culture versus how far that's just an expression of an unlikable person. It's actually a bit of both. But so she was crying about how we were leaving the country and she's going to be upset. And while crying, she was itinerizing the material possessions she wanted to appropriate from us. And I was only going to have two reactions to that as a Westerner. One, if you're going to be emotionally upset, I'm going to be upset about me leaving, I can engage with that. But if you're going to list in detail, like all the items you want me to leave for you from my house, I can engage with that too. but I'm not going to be very sympathetic to your tears about me leaving. If they're tears like, oh my God, you're leaving and it's so terrible. By the way, the CD player, can I have that? Oh, you're leaving. It's so terrible. By the way, the frying pans, can I keep those? Oh, you're leaving. It's so terrible. Can you give me $20? So what I did in that case is that I thought, what would it be best if I prioritized for this kid? And I thought, of course, material possessions. So I said, yeah, take all the stuff. Um, but I couldn't engage with both as a Westerner. Part of this is more complex. Part of it was that the concept of private property has a different place, or did back then, 20 years ago, have a different place in Tongan culture than it does now. It's much more fluid. Items sort of change possession very fluently and freely. And it's not entirely persuasive to then claim that something is entirely yours. To the point that you actually had to be very careful about that in Tonga. You could praise something and then just receive it. And that could be a basket or a pig, or a baby, which happened with all three in my case. So in that moment, there is no West European culture and Tongan culture. There's a new us, a new we to be negotiated. We are there, we're together in the same space. This kid is crying. I'm either going to be empathetic with the kid's tears, or I'm going to give the kid all my stuff. I don't feel like engaging with both, because that would be fake. I can't do that without faking it. So I chose to engage with the material stuff. Is the point clear? There are not two cultures, right, which represent different forms of life that can be compared across distance to one another. There's a third entity in place, there, a new us, a new we to be negotiated, and that was the dance between me and this kid from the village who took my stuff. So what this means is that even if cultural relativism is true, which I think it is to a great extent across vast historical distances, right? You're not going to tell Ivan the Terrible that he didn't respect human rights and get any normative purchase on that at all. You're just going to be really silly if you push that. You could push some general ethical observations about Ivan, like he was cruel, but you couldn't impose any sort of liberal values on him. That would be ridiculous. It would require you to argue that the development of liberal values in 18th century Europe is a kind of progress that is also progress on the terms of the world which the modern world replaced. And you're not going to be able to argue that. But even if you thought you could argue that, as certain kinds of liberal universalists think, none of this really matters. The point is that well, the relativism no longer applies when there is real cultural contact, because you're negotiating a new us, a new we. Vlad, you talk a lot about the left being dead. What would it take, in your opinion, to revitalize the center left, but also the proper? Well, the way the left needs to go in the West is to emphasize class and material conditions and stop emphasizing group identity. Roughly. Okay, enough. So I'm going to welcome, with a suspension to be answered next time, detailed political questions like, what are the Russians going to do about the sanctions on them? And I'm going to prioritize questions about, how do we know that Trump is bad? Like, what kind of leverage do we have to say that? How do we know that, I don't know, Putin isn't just a Russian way of being that we can't criticize, and so on? Where do we get purchase for these arguments about what's good and what's bad? How far can we go with them, and so on? So let's rock and roll ourselves a little bit around that, but with a political emphasis, because of course this is at the very core of all of your political experience. You're constantly discriminating between better and worse states normatively. Not to miss any super thanks. The deterministic test tracking, the deterministic view of physics and biology, it's totally demolished by Einstein. No, you've not quite understood my point. Um, Nothing that physics says has any bearing on the question of the fact that physics underdetermines social explanation. Now, in the manosphere, this is often sort of confused, and people will out the word quantum. Um, uh, there is no truth about physics currently available to us or hypothetically discoverable that has any import whatever on the fact that physics underdetermines social explanation. Um, so either I'm being mean to you and misunderstanding what you've said, and maybe I am, but if I'm not misunderstanding, you're saying that Einstein demolished the view that physics determines the way we explain the social world. If you wanted to say that, then there'd be a problem. What would happen once a big amount of Garantansovsky? What would happen if a big amount of Western countries turn right-wing authoritarian? Would all rivalries and war come back? Um, we're very, very far away from war between European countries, between West European countries in particular. Um, but the idea of a war between France and Germany is not an impossibility. We're just very far removed from it. But you have to understand countries go to war, and a war between West European states is entirely feasible this century. I just wouldn't bet on it, but we have to understand that history is history. There's nothing that we have done that sort of magically precludes this. Um, but what I would also say is you don't model bad things that could happen in the 21st century on bad things that happened in the 20th century. You can use ideas about our experience of bad things in the 20th century. You could read some Hannah Arendt or Isaiah Berlin. Um, and that could help you make sense of authoritarianism. But what I don't want to say is that we're entering the 1930s. You can use that analogy, and it feels a tiny bit, but not too much of the 30s. You can say that, but don't think that where we're heading is like that. The kind of authoritarianism we'll experience will be much less bad, but also much less reversible. Let's have a look around. I've made it very difficult for you with questions because it's ambiguous what the remit is for us. So it's my fault, and I apologize. So just have a go. I'm going to be a bit prejudiced towards questions of a more sort of abstract, ethical, intercultural kind. Do you have an opinion? I'll be quick on this about academia and the issues there regarding the lack of self-awareness among scholars. It decreases public trust and the level of hyper-identity politics. Yes, most academics, let's say in Britain, are not woke, but they have pretended to be woke. They'll stop pretending over the next 5 years. Um, it's going to take a while, though, for these institutions to de-woke themselves, but unfortunately, it's not going to be a renormalization. Unfortunately, as woke goes down, um, authoritarian attempts to pressure institutions to make them lose their independence will go up. And so we're going to have an evil replaced by a worse evil. I'm reading Beautiful Community. I'm not frozen. Cheryl is saying anarchism is distinctly Ukrainian historically. Um, there is something anarchist in Ukrainian political mythologies. You're pulling it in the right direction, but at the level of texts, anarchism is French and Russian. It's also very, I mean, with a lot of literary and philosophical texts, it's impossible to say what's Russian and what's Ukrainian historically. We'll have a separate conversation about how to frame that. And often you can't frame it. You're asking an extraordinary question. Could Nazism have only arisen in Germany due to their specific culture? We don't know what gave way to the rise of Nazism. Um, I once attended a very interesting lecture, maybe 20, 25 years ago, by the German sociologist Wolf Lepenies about the German roots of Nazism. What I would say is that many distortions of sound European ideals are incorporated into that catastrophic political movement. The transformation of life via technology, um, self-expression through the imposition of will on the world and making the world via an application of willpower. That's an essential romantic, Western romantic ideal that can take benign and malign forms. Um, so there were a lot of distorted European ideals that went into that enterprise. What you would need to explain it would be a combination of European culture, German culture, fundamentally, and this is probably bigger than any other slot, social explanation that goes beyond the particularities of any culture, what human beings do under particular social conditions, economics, and a very, 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 very big I don't know basket, right? What you don't want to say is it happened because it was caused by an equation of modernity plus being German, right? That, I mean, that would be astonishingly naive. What you also don't want to do is collapse into a kind of evasion which says that you don't need to explain it because it was just monstrous and unintelligible. Um, I'm sorry, but that absolutely extraordinarily dark moment in human history um, is in principle intelligible through and through. It's very difficult to grasp, it's difficult to access, it's difficult to come to terms with, but it's intelligible through and through. So what you need is A, discipline about going very slowly, and B, an understanding that you get kind of a blend of different kinds of cultural and social explanations. What philosophers should we begin reading in light of times we live in now? I think that I believe that the contribution philosophy makes to society is precisely about its independence from the immediate problems society faces, as well as its dependence on those. Um, so this is paradoxical, but philosophy contributes the most to democratic freedoms and liberal rights when it is not weaponized to maximize democratic freedoms and liberal rights. Therefore, the kind of philosophy you should read is the kind of philosophy that you should read, no matter what cultural circumstances you're in. So this means that you read the philosophy in your native language, preferably, and you read philosophy that's well written. Um, so in English, you could read David Hume. You don't need to read Kant. If you're German, you could read the better works of Nietzsche, not the worst works of Nietzsche. Very, very great deal to go on with if you're Italian or French or Spanish. So you do that, but you focus on um, what is the philosophy that has a good literary expression. I suppose you can read one thing in translation that is still marvelous literature in translation. That's Plato. But my recommendation is to sort of go against the current here. Um, people are going to say, "Oh my God, authoritarianism! Let's all read Hannah Arendt." Okay, um, but I think you'd be better off reading a much greater writer than Arendt, that doesn't directly speak to our circumstances, and in virtue of the depth with which they engage with the world, you'll end up feeling that they speak even more than you know the original choice of work might have spoken, if the original choice of work was one based on sort of relevance to our culture. I'd recommend to demote the term relevance when you're choosing philosophy books. Lou is asking a question about how the Russians and the Americans have the most mercurial citizenry. It doesn't, the very nature of the US uncertainty and so on, point to an unforeseen event. Interesting direction of thought. I'm not sure I'm entirely grasping the complexity of your thought. Um, I just had a qualifier that unforeseen events are unforeseen because they're unforeseen. It's very important that there are certain historical events, like coups, like revolutions, um, which are remarkable for their discontinuity with what came before. Um, they're remarkable precisely because they couldn't easily be read of what came before. Um, that's an important thought to keep in mind. There are certain events that have a kind of constitutive unpredictability. Do I think we're giving up on objectivity in the West? Yes. In our culture wars, we have gone from the relativism of woke to the relativism of the authoritarian right. The politics of the authoritarian right is, in a fascistized way, relativist in part because it goes with the thought that wherever I project my power, truth lies. So I do think that that's a problem. Then there is a separate question: how do we preserve institutions whose task it is to engage in the kind of coercive discourse? Because you see, a marketplace of ideas doesn't generate truth; it untethers us from truth. In fact, it generates a preponderance of exponentially magnifying noise. So how do we maintain institutions, in particular the academy, which remain successful at the pursuit of the difference between getting the world right and getting the world wrong, especially when they are weak, when they are underfunded, when they are passive, and when they're going to be under assault from governments taking an authoritarian turn? This is going to be difficult for us. Um, do I think, as far as democratic decline goes, the Scandi countries are in a better place? Yes, but that's where they are. They're in a better place, but they're exposed to all the same social forces that we are. Um, so the collapse of democracy in Scandinavian countries is entirely possible in the 21st century. Oh, it's Goran. I'm sorry, I didn't. I'm barely literate when I read um, on screen. What obligations, Jim is asking, do I have to challenge the political myths of friends in foreign countries where I've lived and studied extensively? I fear some myths are essential, or at least important for now. Um, I think this takes us back water, to cultural confrontation. Sometimes you got to do it, and you got to challenge ideas that you think are wrong, but also have a positive social function. But I think the principle for whether you challenge it or not depends on your authenticity. You don't want to bullshit people. If you want to have a meaningful relationship with, you don't bullshit them. Let me regurgitate an example from my own biography. Somebody I knew, many of you have heard me tell this story already a couple of times. Somebody I knew, a young woman, Peace Corps volunteer, about 20 years ago, was fatally attacked by a tiger shark in Tonga. And it was a very unlucky circumstance where all kinds of factors converged. She swam out in a very deep passage of water while following a boat at dusk. Um, Sharks eat at that point. Tiger sharks were known to have congregated in that particular channel. Um, there's a meeting point between fresh and salt water nearby, which is also a shark risk. Sharks follow boats because things fall off the back of them. So, um, and she was waving to a friend on the boat, which made her resemble a seal. There's almost no history of shark attacks in Tonga because the sharks are so well fed. Um, but this was a tragic event, and the locals said that this was because this young woman, Tessa, was immoral, because only ethically bad people lose their lives at sea. And me and a couple of other people staying with me sort of referred to marine biology as a subject that is completely silent on ethics, a subject that studies the behavior of sharks, whose um, uh, hunting and pursuit of food is in no way mediated by moral factors. And eventually, some of the locals began to kind of agree. Well, if these Westerners, some of them seem to study sharks at university, maybe they're right. So maybe um, uh, maybe it was a contingent disaster. But then a few weeks later, when a boy from a neighboring village got taken out to sea by a rip, the same local said, "Oh no, he was then morally culpable." And sort of we said, well, what's the difference? The difference being that he was Tongan. So this was an example of a mythology halfway to breaking down. Um, but I couldn't have, and any Westerner really, if they were acquainted with the person who lost their life in this tragic circumstances, couldn't have but argued back. Like, what are you seriously accusing you accusing my friend of um, having something morally wrong with them when they lost their life through this contingent disaster? I mean, wake up, wake up! You've been sitting too long on a hot island and it's got to your head. Please, come on. Oh, okay, yeah, maybe, yeah. So that's a classic example of where just cultural confrontation in of itself means that you can't be authentic without challenging the local mythology. It's an extreme example, but it's a structurally useful one. So don't ever be inauthentic. Be you, and don't think in the first place about your particular understanding of the beneficial social function of something that you regard to be as an untruth. Um, and then, if you asked me, um, is it better that this myth breaks down for the locals, or is it better that they keep it? The point isn't that I think it's better. The point is I think it just needs to be challenged, because it'd be inauthentic not to challenge it. Is it better? Is it worse? It's both. Maybe even it's worse. But that's part of the tragedy of the modern world. There's a level of reflectiveness in the modern world that is destructive of many ethical ideas we used to have in the past, where in a world that is ethically impoverishing us, in virtue of the level of, if you like, reflective luminosity that it necessarily comes with. Um, so, some kind of um, 19th century British utilitarian would say, well, nothing is lost at all when they stop believing what they believed about the sea and now think that it's all contingent and naturalistic. Um, that would be false. I think a lot of richness and depth is lost when you lose the idea that there's some kind of ethical implication with things that happen at sea. Then I suppose a complete cultural relativist in a Wittgensteinian mode might come and say, well, there was a confrontation between two different ways of life in that conversation, and all that happened is that one exercised power over the other, but there is no way of one being privileged over the other. Well, I'm sorry, there is. My view is not better, but it is reflectively better because it gets the sharks right. And somebody like Nietzsche would say, well, that kind of cultural evolution might actually be damaging, but that doesn't change the fact that there's a truth about the sharks that you can't avoid. And so you do damage to the myths by confronting better the truth about sharks. In the context of a political project, is there such a thing as too soon when it comes to advocating for civil liberties? Whenever you engage in politics, you need to understand that you are always engaging with the question of what is and what isn't possible, and with how far and how far are we not stuck in a particular circumstance. If you're dealing with certain issues, it might be that there is a kind of mountain which you can climb, And about climbing a mountain, you can always say it's possible to go a meter further up. Um, so it's a kind of an incremental trajectory. You can just stop when you can't go further. I'm falsifying the experience of mountaineering a bit, but that's okay. On the other hand, there are some political issues which are more like flying a plane across the Atlantic, whereby you can't just say, couldn't we try to go a meter further? You either have the fuel to get across the pond or you don't. If you have 90% of the fuel to get across the pond, your flight is going to end very badly. So that's true of some political issues. So that's one point to bear in mind. A second point to bear in mind is that when you're fighting for rights, let's say that you're fighting for women's rights, or even for women's rights in a particular profession, let's say, you need to understand that women's rights can progress, but they can also roll back. So, what you also don't want to do is engage in the kind of politics that aims at progressing women's rights, but actually contributes to the creation of conditions that roll women's rights back. You've got to understand, and this is a huge problem that the technocratic center and whatever is of the left in Europe, largely in the West, largely ignores that wherever we are with the rights of minorities today, there's always the possibility of rollback. And the prevention of rollback is just as important a goal as the pursuit of advancement. So you've got to understand that too. Just a couple of remarks on that question. Why do I consider Drape is asking the current centrist elites technocratic? I consider them technocratic because fundamentally, in this cartoonish sense, um, technocracy is the notion that you can observe conflicts out there in society around particular issues and then say, we can turn to experts to concoct solutions or compromises to these conflicts that are going to work best. And what happens when you do that is that you depoliticize political decision making. You don't say, well, that group has made a very compelling case, so we're going to yield to it a bit. This group has made a less compelling case, we're going to yield to it less. Instead, you say, both groups shut up. We're going to get experts to work out what you would have settled on if you understood the issues better than you do. But the problem is that risks intellectualizing political difference, which is not intellectual difference. It's difference that is fundamentally about a negotiation of shared space.